Ellen O'Neill is Executive Director of the YWCA of Duluth. Over the past 40 years, Ellen O'Neill has made standing up against racial and gender inequities a central part of her personal and professional life. She has served as Executive Director of the YWCA of Duluth since 2003, where she works to eliminate racism and empower women and girls. She doesn't shy away from topics like white privilege and works to educate people about how this form of systemic racism has a profoundly negative effect on communities. She was nominated for her leadership in working with people and organizations in Duluth to break the silence around racism, an effort that has sparked thousands of conversations in families, workplaces, community gatherings, and in the media. The St. Paul Foundation is honored to recognize Ellen's courageous advocacy for racial equity in the Duluth area. As our Minnesota Ambassador Award recipient, Ellen will receive a $10,000 grant made in her name to the organization of her choice. Ladies and gentlemen, Ellen O'Neill.
I am honored and humbled to be the Minnesota recipient of the Race Ambassador Award this year. As we all know, leadership is not a solitary endeavor. Therefore, I accept this award on behalf of the board and the staff of the YWCA of Duluth, of the 17 partners in the Unfair campaign, who have been courageous and brave and have broken the silence about racism and racial disparities, and for the citizens of Duluth who have stood up and said, enough, something has to change. We heard Dr. Pasteur speak tonight about the changing demographics and how our country, our state, and our communities are becoming more racially diverse. This will surely change how race looks in our communities, but will it change how racism operates? That is our challenge. For many years, the lens I looked through was racism impacts people of color. It was not my issue. Over time, I came to understand that what happens to people of color does have something to do with me. I began to question everything, and I began to look at history, systems of privilege, and institutional racism. My whole worldview began to change, and I saw that I was complicit in keeping racism going, and I could no longer remain silent. In 2003, I became the executive director of the Duluth YWCA. YWCAs throughout this country share a common mission of empowering women and eliminating racism. I am proud to be working with an organization that boldly states that in its mission, on its brand, on t-shirts, on banners, on the sides of their buildings. In 2008, the YWCA of Duluth began a strategic planning process. As part of that process, we asked ourselves, what can we do at this time in history to honor the mission of eliminating racism? What we decided was that the dominant lens and worldview of white privilege had to be challenged. That white people needed to see our part in the perpetuation of racism, and we needed to see our part in the solutions. Racism is more than individual prejudice based on race. Racism is the power of a dominant group through our systems and institutions to enforce our history, our values, our practices, and our beliefs. And I say our, standing here as a white woman who is part of the dominant culture in this country. It advantages those in the dominant group and disadvantages those who are not. It results in racial disparities. The racial disparities in the achievement gap in Minnesota schools has been well documented. We rank among the worst in the United States. In Duluth, 75% of white students graduate in 4 years, compared to 27% of American Indian students and 40% of African American students. Clearly, something is wrong. The youth of our communities need to see that we are challenging racism and working to challenge racial disparities. If we as adults do nothing, then the message we give them is that the status quo is acceptable. I am honored to share the stage tonight with another leader from Duluth, Daniel, who in his work as a leader in our community reminds us as a role model that we must speak out. Duluth is 90% white. People often ask me, how can you do racial justice work in a community like that when there are so few people of color? If the goal is shifting the lens and changing the worldview of white people, engaging us in seeing our part in racism and getting our ownership in the solutions, then Duluth is an excellent place to do that work. So in 2010, the Duluth YWCA began to put together a bold initiative, the Unfair Campaign. The first step was to develop a partnership of organizations and institutions in our community who were willing to look at racism within our own systems. That partnership still exists. That same partnership launched a public campaign in 2012 for our community. Using posters, billboards, a website, Facebook, workshops, films, speakers, a major exhibit on race and racism, and events in all of the partner organizations, the silence around racism was broken, and racial disparities were unveiled. The response was immediate and loud, and it continues. It also has changed our community, and there is no going back. Our next step as a community is to stand together, white people and people of color, as allies, to begin to address the significant racial disparities that exist in our community, and we will do that. I want to thank the St. Paul Foundation for their leadership in this area and for their staff who, as part of the Unfair Campaign, came up to Duluth 3 times to lead their new conversations on race and racism. In the words of this event, the conversation is not over until racism is over. Racism is alive and well, so each one of us in this room have a role to play in eliminating it. Let's get to it. Thank you.